Brian Brown, appreciate you joining me today here at the Christian Post. There's a lot to break down on Open Doors US and this new World Watch list. Every year, you guys look essentially at the places in the world where it is the hardest, the most dangerous, the most deadly, the most problematic to be a Christian. These are countries where persecution is absolutely the worst. Now, let's start here. What is the single most alarming takeaway from this year's World Watch list?
Yeah, I think the single greatest takeaway is that persecution continues to grow around the globe. Last year we reported 380 million. That was a record number last year, suffered persecution and discrimination because of their faith in Jesus. This year, that number has climbed to 388. If you do dive down kind of a second level under that, you will see that the scores that we utilized to track all of these things have also reached a composite record high level. So it shows that the breadth of persecution has expanded, but also the severity.
You know, it's disturbing to consider that in 2026 that we're dealing with a situation where persecution, which you would hope as society modernizes and, you know, on paper should be moving forward, you would see those numbers decline, but they're increasing and the intensity itself, as you said, is increasing. Now, which countries or regions saw the biggest changes and what is driving those shifts?
Yeah, the biggest single change was Syria. And that honestly, from one year to the next was the biggest change since we had updated our methodology in 2014. And so it's the biggest change that we've seen in a single year for a country since that change. What has been driving that, many may be familiar that the Assad regime fell in Syria and HTS stepped in and has taken control of that country. There were a lot of concerns about that HTS did not necessarily have a track record of sympathy towards Christians or in partnering well with them. But there was also a cautious optimism of what the future could hold as they were vocalizing an intent to allow freedom of religious expression for people of all faith. What we have seen there is, that the persecution has not been driven by the hand of the new government, but rather by their lack of control. The lack of rule of law in these areas has created all sorts of vacuums of power that extremists have stepped into and created all sorts of issues. This is areas of Syria that it historically been, had some relatively safe harbor for Christians. That has not been the case. We've seen even those areas fall under pressure. Even in areas like Damascus, churches are receiving leaflets, postings on their door from extremist groups telling them that they need to convert. There's also a convention of where they can pay a tax, if you will, for safety for non-Muslims, and they're told that they can either convert, pay money, or they need to vacate. And so they are receiving these ominous threats. Many will also be familiar with the church attack that happened last summer, killed 22, injuring 66 more. So it's been a very, very difficult year for Syria.
Yeah, it's really heartbreaking. And when you look at Syria, you also wonder, and this is speculation, and feel free to comment on it or not, but the president of Syria, Ahmed al-Sharaa, is somebody who was an Al-Qaeda member fighting U.S. forces, I believe, in Iraq years ago. And, as you were saying, though, coming into this, saying there was going to be freedom for all, you do wonder if, even if that is the goal, we can't know people's hearts, freedom for all, that past and people knowing that past, you wonder if it does empower some of the groups, on the ground to maybe go harder on these things with the assumption that maybe the government, because there is no control, won't be able to curb or isn't maybe as willing to curb as they're saying. I don't know if you want to reflect on that at all, but it does seem complicated.
It is complicated. And I do think that it is absolutely true that individuals have seen the weakness there, as that the government is it's yet to be seen whether actions will align with their words, and in that uncertainty folks have looked to take advantage and exploit that uncertainty, exploit that lack of rule of law currently in play.
So, Iran obviously is in the headlines right now. It's a fast moving situation. And so we won't go too deep into every piece of it. But what I am curious is, where is Iran on the list, and why is it important for Christians to understand the persecution that happens there in light of what we're watching happen right now?
Yeah, this very well probably prove to be a moment in history for Iran, which could be consequential. And I know that many pray that is the case. Iran is number 10 on the list. And one of the realities that we've seen over the course of this last year is, specifically after the Israeli attacks into Iran last year, there was an uptick in the number of arrests of Christians and the number of those being detained. There is a belief by Iranian officials that Christianity is aligned with the West and aligned with inherently with an agenda to destabilize and to overthrow the current regime. And so anybody who is known to be a Christian is immediately assumed to be seditious, immediately assumed to be in opposition and a threat to the state. And so as we've seen with the protests that are going on, the state has been looking to, very aggressively try to curb all those things that are transpiring there.
There's so many nations on this list. Obviously, you look at the top, 50, and you can go through all the different types of persecution. But one nation that you and I have talked about in the past and has gotten a lot of attention, again, because of recent events, Nigeria and other parts of Africa, we're seeing a lot of extreme violence there. What is driving that persecution there? And just talk about the extent of it. Because when you talk about intensity and the deadly nature of it, we're seeing some really unthinkable things happen, again, particularly in Nigeria.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Nigeria really continues to be the epicenter of what is going on throughout the continent, sub-Saharan Africa. And, this is a rise in the violence. We saw more Christians killed because of their faith last year in Nigeria than all other places on the globe combined. And, what I find so interesting, and you are well aware that this, there are many people out there that are saying, well, Christian persecution is not even happening in Nigeria. Look to deny that there is even a reality there. It is a complicated situation. There are a lot of nuances and layers, but the only way that you can really arrive at that conclusion that Christian persecution is not a factor is to completely marginalize the voices of the victims, completely marginalize the voices of those that have been attacked. Because once you do take the time to sit with, as we sit with individuals and look to minister in that context and hear the stories are horrific. And it is impossible to see how, how Christian persecution is not a factor in the dynamic at what is in play. A common thread through a lot of these things are, Islamic extremist ideologies that are being pushed, seeking control, seeking power. Christians are seen as a threat and an opposition to that. And so, Christians labeled as infidels or other labels that get attached are that the extremists are looking to stamp them out.
It's interesting, too, because you can have economic factors in a situation like Nigeria that are driving some of it, but you have groups that are very openly, and you know this better than anyone, talking about, and not just talking about, actually slaughtering Christians and killing them. And it seems very clear that there's persecution unfolding there. Seeing how some of the media narrative has covered that over the last 6 months has been very interesting in the West, especially because it felt like Nigeria wasn't getting a lot of attention. Then when it was getting attention, there were these questions about whether or not persecution was actually happening. And this is something you have been tracking, Open Doors US and other groups, for quite some time. Where did Nigeria fall on this year's list?
They are number 7 on the list again this year. Again, they did see an increase in the number of individuals that were killed. And they have led that category for a number of years now. It is tragic what is going on, and I think one of the things that breaks my heart the most is as I sit with pastors and have opportunity to engage with pastors from Nigeria. Is it's one thing to experience these things; it's another thing to be told that your lived experiences aren't happening, to have those things be denied, and to have in essence somebody around the world calling you a liar. And as you try to relay your experiences, I was with a pastor from Nigeria on the day that President Trump had declared Nigeria as a country of particular concern, and he said that he'd spent the last 15 years trying to let people know about what is going on in Nigeria, trying to raise attention around the world, and he felt that his voice had routinely been ignored by so many. And so they are thankful that, the world is starting to wake up and starting to take notice of these things. I think for us as Christians, this is an important opportunity. This is an important time because, our brothers and sisters, as horrific as the experiences they face are, so many of them, that the things that they ask for was, as we come alongside them, are not first and foremost that we end their suffering, that we end their struggles, but is that we not leave them alone in those struggles, that we not ignore that those struggles are happening, that they want us to enter into prayer with them, that they want to know that there's a global body of believers around the globe that's standing with them, willing to lock arms through prayer and through solidarity.
Yeah, and I think there's a real effort that needs to happen through outlets like the Christian Post and other media outlets out there to correct this record that other outlets are not really doing a great job covering, because you're seeing these stories firsthand of what is happening there, and to deny that is sort of unbelievable. But that is something that we have seen happen. Let's talk about North Korea, because North Korea remains near the top of the list. What's going on there? Have there been any changes? I know this is a hermit nation. There's not a lot of information on what goes on inside. Take us through where they are on the list and what we do know.
Yeah, they remain on the top of that list. That's a spot that they've occupied for the majority of the years that this list has been in existence. And just to help unpack what that looks like, this is a place where Christians or anyone, just to be found in possession of a Bible, you and your entire family can be arrested, can be thrown into hard work labor camps for the rest of your life. The regime in power sees Christianity as a threat to the state and will do everything that they can to stamp that out.
It is incredibly heartbreaking. And these are all, we're going country by country here in a lot of ways. These are prayer points for people, for Christians who are listening to this, to be marking down the people of these countries and the leaders and the terror groups, that there be changed hearts and changed minds. Do you think that there are countries, we talked a little bit about Nigeria, where the persecution is severe, but they're largely ignored by Western media? I mean, are there other nations that you're seeing on this list where you're saying to yourself, why in the world are our media outlets not talking about what is happening here?
I would say across the list of 50, yes. I mean, each and every one of them has stories. Certainly you take a look at countries like the top 10 and Somalia. I don't think that most of the world recognize what's going on, or even in places where, the media may have coverage of places like Sudan and the ongoing civil war. Very little thought or attention is placed on how this specifically and uniquely can impact the Christian populations in those places. A little bit closer to home here, even countries like Mexico, there are so many churches that will send trips, missions trips to Mexico and things, but very little awareness of some of the realities that are being experienced there, specifically in the southern part of Mexico. The northern parts, I think that many of us recognize that organized crime is a factor, as organized crime has seen the church as being bad for business, taking away customers, taking away workforce. Organized crime is really, the cartels have often, the church has found themselves in the crossfire And those aren't stories that are often told. Those aren't realities that most of us recognize, even though they're so close in proximity to us. But these are the realities that so many of our brothers and sisters around the globe are facing. And again, they're asking for us to enter in with them. They're asking us to stand with them in prayer.
I want to close out on something positive here because, as positive as it can be, this issue is the most horrific it's ever been. The numbers keep getting worse, but people are clinging to their faith. I mean, how are persecuted believers holding on to their faith under the kind of pressures that we're talking about here today?
Well, and I so appreciate you bringing that point up because you are absolutely correct. Because if we have a conversation like this and we walk away with just a sense of despair of what is happening halfway around the world, we've completely missed the larger point of this story. And, the reality is we could end Christian persecution today if the church were just to lay down, if the church were to say, this great commission that Jesus told to go into all the world to make disciples and to baptize them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. We're not going to do that. But the fact that the church continues to come under fire, the fact that the church is being persecuted is because the church is continuing to advance. It's because the church is continuing to love its neighbors, because the church is continuing to take the gospel into some of these places that is most opposed to that message of the gospel. Our enemy, the devil, walks around like a lion seeking those he can devour. He's seeking to destroy those that are advancing. He's seeking to destroy and come against a church that is at work, a church that's doing what Christ called it to do. And so at the heart of this, there is a story of victory because we see glimpses of this all the time. The light just peeking through the darkness of where, Jesus promised that not even the gates of hell are going to prevail against his church. That is happening. That is happening around the globe as Christians, in so many of these places that we look at on the list. The church is growing. Places like North Korea, places like Iran, the church is seeing, incredible numbers that are coming to faith in Christ and coming to know him as their Lord and Savior. And so this ultimately is a story of victory. It's a hard story. It's a difficult story. There are sad elements to it, but we know that Christ is at work.
Well, I so appreciate you taking the time, breaking this down. There's so much more in the World Watch List report. Where can people go to access that?
Yeah, go to opendoorsus.org. You'll see information there to download. As you mentioned earlier, these are prayer points, and that World Watch List is not just an informational resource. It is a prayer resource. There are prayer requests from each of these countries so that we can be praying with our brothers and sisters, but it's opendoorsus.org.
I so appreciate you taking the time today and joining me. Thanks so much.
Thank you.